The sound came first, sharp and clean, the kind that makes an entire room forget how to breathe. And for a second no one moved. Not the waiters holding silver trays, not the investors mid-conversation, not even the string quartet frozen in a single suspended note. Because something had just happened that didn't belong in a room like this, not under crystal chandeliers and million-dollar smiles. And at the center of it all stood Emily Carter, one hand resting instinctively over the gentle curve of her 7-month pregnancy, her eyes wide not with fear, but with something quieter, something colder, the realization that everything she had believed about her life had just cracked in front of 200 witnesses. And across from her, Daniel Whitmore adjusted his cufflinks like a man fixing a minor inconvenience. His expression composed, practiced, the same face that had closed deals worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. As if what just happened was nothing more than a misunderstanding that would disappear if ignored long enough. But it didn't disappear, because someone near the back of the ballroom had already lifted a phone, and then another, and another. Tiny glowing screens capturing a moment that would not stay contained inside those marble walls. And somewhere between the flicker of those screens and the silence stretching too long, something shifted, not just in the room, but in the story itself. Because moments like this don't end quietly, they echo, they travel, they grow teeth. And what no one in that room understood yet was that this was not the peak of the story. It was the beginning of the collapse. Because 2 hours earlier, Emily had stood in front of a mirror in a high-rise apartment overlooking the Chicago skyline, smoothing the fabric of a deep blue gown that no longer quite fit the way it used to. The city lights reflecting in the glass behind her like a promise she had once believed in. And she had paused, just for a second, her fingers lingering over her belly as the baby shifted, a soft, steady reminder that there was something more important than the tension she had been trying to ignore for months. Because Daniel had been distant, distracted, his late nights becoming longer, his words shorter, his attention somewhere else entirely. But tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight was the annual Whitmore Foundation Gala, the kind of event where appearances mattered, where smiles were currency, where marriages were displayed like polished assets. And Emily had told herself that whatever distance had grown between them could be fixed, that maybe all it needed was one perfect evening, one moment of remembering who they used to be. And for a while, when they arrived, it almost felt that way. Cameras flashing, guests greeting them with admiration, the kind reserved for power couples who looked like they had everything under control. But then came the small things, the glances Daniel didn't return, the conversations he ended too quickly, the way his attention drifted across the room and stayed there just a second too long. And when Emily followed that gaze, she saw her, standing near the bar, poised, confident, a woman who looked like she belonged in every room she entered. And in that instant something quiet and undeniable settled into Emily's chest. Not panic, not even anger, just clarity, the kind that arrives without permission and refuses to leave. And still, she walked forward. Still she chose to stand beside her husband under the bright lights. Still she believed, even as the room held its breath without knowing why, that this night could be saved. But stories like this don't turn on hope, they turn on truth. And the truth was already moving, already being recorded, already leaving the room long before anyone realized that what had just begun would not end in silence. The room did not return to normal. It only pretended to. Conversations restarting a fraction too loud, laughter coming a beat too late, as if everyone had silently agreed to step around what had just happened instead of through it. And Emily could feel it. The shift in the air, the way eyes moved toward her and then quickly away, the way whispers formed without sound. Because in rooms like this, reputation was everything, and moments like this rewrote it in real time. And Daniel leaned slightly closer to her, his voice low, controlled, the same tone he used in boardrooms when numbers did not align, telling her quietly to compose herself, to remember where they were, as if dignity was something she had misplaced rather than something that had just been tested in front of an audience that would not forget. And Emily did not answer right away, not because she did not have words, but because she was choosing which version of herself would speak. The one who had spent years smoothing over his edges, or the one who had just realized those edges were never accidents. And across the room, the woman by the bar was still watching, not hiding it now, her expression calm, almost curious, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment to unfold. And that was when Emily understood that nothing about tonight had been unexpected, not the distance, not the tension, not even the silence that followed. It had all been building towards something, and she had been the last to see it clearly. But clarity, once it arrives, does not leave, and she straightened slightly, her hand still resting over her belly, grounding herself in something real, something that did not depend on appearances or approval. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, softer than the room deserved, but strong enough to carry, asking a simple question that did not accuse and did not plead, just asked, "Who is she?" And for the first time that evening, Daniel hesitated. Not long, just a flicker, but long enough to confirm everything that mattered, because hesitation in a man like him meant calculation, and calculation meant there was something to protect, something to manage, something already in motion behind the scenes. And before he could respond, the woman herself began to walk toward them, her steps measured, unhurried, the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly where you stand, and each step seemed to draw more attention, more silence, until she was there within arm's reach, offering a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes, introducing herself as Vanessa Hale, her tone professional, almost courteous, as if this were a networking event rather than the unraveling of a marriage. And Emily noticed the small details, the way Vanessa stood slightly closer to Daniel than necessary, the way Daniel did not step away, the way their proximity carried familiarity that could not be explained by business alone. And in that moment, the noise of the room faded again, replaced by something quieter but heavier, the sound of realization settling into place. Because betrayal is rarely loud when it reveals itself. It is precise, it is controlled, it arrives dressed as coincidence until it can no longer hide. And Emily felt the weight of it, not as panic but as a shift in direction, like standing at the edge of a path you did not know you were on until it ended. And somewhere near the back of the room, another phone lifted, capturing not just a moment, but a story beginning to take shape. And far from the ballroom, miles away in a different part of the city, a man named Jacob Carter watched that story appear on his screen, his expression unreadable as the video played, once, then again. And something in his posture changed, not with anger, not with urgency, but with decision, the kind that does not need to be spoken out loud, because some responses are not immediate, they are inevitable. And what started as a single moment in a crowded room was already becoming something larger, something that would not be contained by apologies or explanations, something that had already begun to move beyond anyone's control. Jacob did not replay the video a third time because he did not need to. The details had already settled into place with the kind of precision that came from years of training himself to notice what others missed, the angle of the room, the reflection of the chandeliers and the polished floor, the distance between Emily and Daniel, the way she held herself even in that moment, steady, contained, refusing to collapse into the scene everyone expected, and that told him more than anything else. Because Emily had always been the one who endured quietly, the one who explained things away, the one who believed in patience long after it stopped being returned. And if she had reached this point in public, then the truth had been unfolding long before tonight. And Jacob set his phone down on the kitchen counter, the screen still glowing with paused images of a room filled with strangers who now knew something deeply personal. And he exhaled once, slow and controlled, not with anger but with clarity, the kind that leaves no room for hesitation. Because this was no longer about what had happened in that ballroom. It was about everything that had been hidden leading up to it. And across the city, Emily remained standing in the same place, the weight of the evening pressing in from all sides. Vanessa's presence still too close, Daniel's silence stretching longer than it should have. And then came the smallest shift, the one no one else seemed to notice. Daniel stepping half an inch away from Emily. Not enough to draw attention, but enough to redefine space. Enough to show alignment without saying it out loud. And that was the moment the last piece settled into place for her. Because betrayal is not confirmed by words, it is confirmed by distance, by the choices people make when they think no one is measuring them. And she felt something inside her steady rather than break, a quiet recalibration, as if her life had been tilted and was now returning to level. And she looked at Vanessa again, this time not as a question, but as an answer already understood. and Vanessa held that gaze for a fraction longer before offering another composed smile, the kind designed for rooms like this, the kind that suggested everything was under control even when it was not. And around them the event began to move again. Conversations picking back up, music resuming, donors and executives returning to the rhythm of the evening. But the center had already shifted, the illusion had already cracked, and Emily realized she no longer needed to remain there to maintain it. So she reached for her clutch, her movements calm, deliberate, not rushed, not dramatic, just final. And Daniel noticed. Of course he did, his expression tightening slightly as he asked where. She was going in a tone that implied expectation rather than concern, and Emily met his eyes one last time in that room. Not searching, not pleading, just observing, as if she were seeing him clearly for the first time without the filter of who she thought he was. And she answered simply that she was going home, and the words landed differently than expected, because they did not sound like retreat. They sounded like a decision already made. And for a brief second Daniel seemed unsure how to respond, caught between maintaining control and acknowledging the shift he could feel, but not yet understand. And Emily turned before he could choose, stepping away from the center of the room, past the guests, who pretended not to notice her leaving, past the cameras that had already captured enough. And as the elevator doors closed behind her, the noise of the gala faded into silence, replaced by the soft hum of motion and the steady rhythm of her own breathing, her hand resting once more over her belly, grounding herself in what mattered, and somewhere above the city lights and below the surface of everything that had just begun. Consequences were already moving, not loudly, not visibly, but with the kind of certainty that does not need to announce itself. Because some stories do not explode, they unfold, and when they do, they take everything with them. The night air felt different when Emily stepped outside, not colder, not warmer, just real, as if the city itself had no interest in pretending the way the ballroom had. And for the first time in hours she allowed herself to pause, standing beneath the soft glow of streetlights as cars moved past in steady lines, headlights cutting through the dark like quiet reminders that the world kept going no matter what had just ended. And she inhaled slowly, deeply, the kind of breath that fills more than lungs, the kind that settles something internal. And her phone buzzed in her hand before she even looked at it. A series of notifications stacking faster than she could process, messages, missed calls, unknown numbers, and she did not need to open them to understand what they were, because moments like tonight did not stay private. They traveled, they multiplied, they turned into something else entirely once they left the room. And for a second she considered ignoring it all, slipping into silence, letting the noise pass without acknowledgement. But then another message came through, one name cutting through the rest with a clarity that made everything else fade. Jacob. And she answered without hesitation, lifting the phone to her ear as she walked toward the waiting car, her voice steady when she said his name, even though she knew he had already seen enough to understand. And there was no rush in his reply, no panic, just a calm that carried weight, asking her one simple question, "Are you safe?" And Emily closed her eyes briefly as she opened the car door, grounding herself in that question, because it was not about the event, not about the humiliation, not about what people would say. It was about her, about what came next, and she answered yes, because she was, not in the way the world measured safety, but in the way that mattered, the way that meant she had stepped out of something that could no longer define her. And Jacob did not ask for details, did not demand explanations. He simply said he was coming to see her, and the line went quiet after that, not empty, just complete, as if everything necessary had already been understood. And as the car pulled away from the curb, Emily watched the building shrink in the distance, the lights of the gala still glowing high above the city like nothing had changed. But she knew better now, because the change had not happened in the room, it had happened in her, in the moment she chose not to stay. And inside that same building Daniel stood exactly where she had left him, but the space around him had shifted, conversations now carrying an edge, glances lasting a second too long, the kind of subtle distancing that powerful people notice even when no one says a word. And Vanessa remained beside him, composed as ever, but even she could not control the ripple that had begun to move through the room. Because reputations built over years can fracture in seconds when the wrong moment reaches the wrong audience, and somewhere between one Handshake, and the next Daniel checked his phone, his expression tightening as he saw what Emily had already known. The video spreading, the narrative forming without his input, without his control, and for the first time that evening he was no longer managing the situation, he was reacting to it, trying to calculate angles that no longer aligned, trying to contain something that had already slipped beyond reach. And miles away Jacob stepped into his truck, the engine turning over with a low, steady sound as he pulled into the night. Not rushing, not hesitating, just moving forward with the kind of certainty that does not require urgency. Because some responses are not about speed, they are about timing. And timing, once it begins, does not stop until everything has been accounted for. And as Emily leaned back against the seat, her hand resting gently where new life continued to move, she realized that what had felt like an ending inside that ballroom was not an ending at all. It was a beginning, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, the kind that changes direction quietly and never looks back. By the time the car reached Emily's building, the city had quieted just enough to make every thought louder. The hum of traffic fading into the background as the driver slowed beneath the covered entrance, and she remained seated for a second longer than necessary. Not because she did not want to move, but because she understood that once she stepped out, nothing about her life would return to what it had been even a few hours ago. And that realization did not scare her the way it once might have. It steadied her, because uncertainty was no longer something she needed to avoid. It was something she had already survived. And when she finally opened the door and stepped onto the pavement, the cool air met her again. Grounding, consistent, unchanged by everything that had unfolded. And upstairs her apartment was exactly as she had left it. Lights dim, quiet, untouched, a stark contrast to the noise she had just walked away from. And she moved through it slowly, setting her clutch down on the kitchen counter, slipping off her heels with careful balance, one hand instinctively supporting herself as she adjusted to the stillness. And her phone buzzed again, but this time she picked it up, not to read everything, just enough to confirm what she already knew, headlines forming, clips circulating, strangers turning a single moment into a narrative they could consume. And she did not linger on it, because for the first time she understood that their interpretation did not define her reality, it only reflected their distance from it. And she set the phone face down just as another sound filled the apartment, a firm knock at the door, not rushed, not hesitant. And she did not need to check who it was before opening it, because some presences announced themselves without words. And Jacob stood there exactly as she expected, steady, composed, his eyes scanning her quickly, not for judgment, but for reassurance, confirming what mattered most in a single glance. And when she stepped aside to let him in, there was no dramatic exchange, no flood of questions, just a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had already been seen. And he moved into the space as if he had always belonged there, setting his keys down, taking in the room with a calm that felt almost protective. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because silence can hold more understanding than conversation when the right people share it. And when he finally did speak, it was not about Daniel, not about the gala, not about the video. It was about what she wanted to do next, and the question landed differently than any other had that night, because it placed the decision back where it belonged, with her. And Emily leaned against the counter, her hand resting gently over her belly as she considered it. Not from a place of reaction, but from clarity, because for so long her choices had been shaped by maintaining something that was already slipping away, and now there was nothing left to maintain, only something new to build. And she answered simply that she was done, not with anger, not with bitterness, just with certainty. And Jacob nodded once, not surprised, not relieved, just acknowledging the direction she had already chosen. And then he reached into his jacket and placed a small folder on the counter between them, not dramatic, not emphasized, just present. And Emily looked at it briefly before meeting his eyes again, understanding without needing explanation that whatever was inside was not a reaction to tonight. It was preparation for something that had been unfolding longer than she realized. And Jacob did not open it, did not explain it. He simply said that there were things she deserved to see when she was ready. And the weight of those words settled into the room with a quiet gravity, because truth, when it arrives, does not rush. It waits until you are strong enough to hold it. And as Emily looked at the folder again, she realized that tonight had not just revealed what was broken. It had revealed how long it had been breaking. and somewhere across the city Daniel stood surrounded by people who were already adjusting their distance, already recalculating their associations, already responding to a story that was no longer his to control. And in that contrast, between a quiet apartment and a crowded ballroom, between clarity and denial, the next chapter had already begun to take shape, not with noise, but with inevitability. Emily did not open the folder right away because some truths demand a moment of stillness before they are seen, and instead she walked to the window, looking out over the city that continued to move without hesitation, headlights tracing quiet lines through the streets below, unaware of the shift that had taken place in one apartment high above. And behind her Jacob remained where he was, patient, giving her space not because he needed to, but because he understood that control, once returned, should not be taken away again. And when she finally turned back, her expression had changed, not softer, not harder, just clearer, as if the uncertainty that had followed her for months had finally burned away. And she reached for the folder, her fingers steady as she opened it, revealing documents arranged with careful precision, financial statements, transaction records, property filings, each page telling a story that had never been spoken out loud. And as her eyes moved across the numbers and signatures, something else began to form, a pattern, not chaotic, not accidental, but deliberate, structured in a way that suggested planning over time rather than a single moment of betrayal. And she paused on one page longer than the others, her brow tightening slightly as she recognized a familiar address listed under a name she had just heard hours ago. And the connection settled into place without needing confirmation, because once you see the truth, you cannot unsee how it fits together. And Jacob stepped closer then, not to take over, but to stand beside her, his voice calm as he explained that he had been watching the situation longer than she knew, not out of suspicion, but out of instinct, the kind that had kept him alive in places where trust could not be assumed. And he had started noticing inconsistencies, small at first, then too consistent to ignore, accounts that did not align, investments routed through unfamiliar channels, names that appeared more than once in places they should not have. And he had followed those threads quietly, carefully, until they led somewhere undeniable. And Emily listened without interruption, not because she was surprised, but because she was finally seeing the full shape of something she had only felt in fragments. And when he finished, she looked back down at the pages, understanding now that what had happened tonight was not the beginning of the problem, it was the exposure of it. And across the city, Daniel stood in his office long after the gala had ended, the building around him mostly dark, his phone lighting up with messages he could not answer fast enough. Advisors, partners, people who once moved in alignment with him, now asking questions he did not want to address. And on his desk, his own set of documents lay scattered, reports pulled up in a rush, numbers reviewed without focus, because control, once assumed, is difficult to reclaim when it slips. And Vanessa stood near the window, her reflection faint against the glass, watching him not with concern but with calculation, her silence carrying its own meaning. Because alliances built in convenience do not always hold under pressure. And Daniel finally looked up at her, searching for reassurance he had come to expect, but what he found instead was distance, subtle but unmistakable. And in that moment he realized something he had not prepared for, that the narrative forming outside his control was beginning to affect what he thought was secure inside it. And back in the apartment, Emily closed the folder slowly, not overwhelmed, not shaken, just resolved, because the truth had not broken her. It had clarified her path, and she looked at Jacob again, not as someone asking for help, but as someone ready to move forward. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of direction, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be understood, because once everything is revealed, the only question left is what you choose to do with it. And Emily already knew her answer. The decision did not arrive with noise. It settled into the room like something that had been waiting for permission, and once it was there, it did not leave, because clarity changes the way time moves. It sharpens it, narrows it down to what matters, and removes everything that does not. And Emily felt that shift as she placed the folder back on the counter, not closing it out of fear, but out of completion, because she no longer needed to keep searching for answers that were already in front of her. And Jacob watched her closely, not to guide her, but to confirm what he already sensed, that she had crossed a line internally that could not be reversed. And when she spoke, her voice carried that same quiet certainty, not raised, not dramatic, just final, telling him she wanted everything documented, everything prepared, not for revenge, but for resolution. And the distinction mattered because what she was building was not a reaction. It was a foundation, something structured, something that would hold under pressure. And Jacob nodded once, understanding the difference without needing it explained, because there are moments when action becomes necessary not because of anger, but because of alignment. And he moved toward the table, pulling out his phone, making a call that was brief and precise, setting things in motion without drawing attention to it, because the most effective moves are rarely visible at the start. And across the city, Daniel was beginning to feel that same shift without yet understanding its source. His office now lit only by the glow of screens as he sat behind his desk, reviewing messages that no longer carried the tone he was used to, partners asking for clarification, board members requesting meetings, advisors suggesting caution in language that felt unfamiliar, and he responded to each one carefully, choosing words designed to stabilize, to reassure, to maintain control over a narrative that was slipping further away with every passing minute. And yet something deeper was beginning to unsettle him. Not the video itself, not even the attention, but the absence of something he had always relied on, predictability. Because for the first time in years he could not anticipate the next move, could not calculate the outcome with the confidence that had defined his decisions, and that uncertainty lingered in the room even as Vanessa remained near the window, her presence quieter now, her attention shifting not toward him but toward her own phone. Her own calculations forming in parallel, because alignment built on advantage does not guarantee loyalty when conditions change, and Daniel noticed it, the subtle withdrawal, the distance measured not in space but in intention, and he realized that whatever had begun tonight was no longer contained within a single relationship. It was expanding outward, touching every connection he had assumed was secure. And back in the apartment, Emily moved with a new rhythm, not hurried, not hesitant, just deliberate, gathering what she needed, organizing what mattered, her movements guided by something steadier than emotion, because once the illusion is gone, decisions become clearer, and Jacob returned to her side, informing her that arrangements were already being made, legal, financial, protective, all the layers that ensure a transition is not just symbolic, but real. And Emily listened, absorbing each detail, not as someone overwhelmed, but as someone prepared, because preparation had replaced uncertainty. And as she looked around the apartment she had once shared with a version of her life that no longer existed, she did not feel lost the way she expected. She felt distance, as if she were already stepping beyond it. And in that distance there was something unexpected, not relief, not yet, but space, the kind that allows something new to take shape. And far below the city continued to move, unaware that within its quiet corners decisions were being made that would soon surface, not with chaos, but with consequence. Because the most powerful shifts do not announce themselves when they begin. They reveal themselves only when everything has already changed. Morning did not arrive gently. It entered the city with a sharp clarity that made everything feel more defined, as if the night had only delayed what daylight would reveal. And Emily was already awake before the first light touched the windows, sitting at the edge of the couch where she had not fully slept, the quiet of the apartment wrapping around her like a space that no longer held uncertainty, only direction. And her phone lay untouched beside her, no longer demanding attention the way it had hours before, because she had already accepted what it contained. And when she finally picked it up, the headlines had shifted from curiosity to speculation, from speculation to analysis, narratives forming around a moment that strangers believed they understood. And she scrolled only briefly, not searching for validation, not reacting to judgment, just confirming that the story had moved beyond containment. And once something becomes public at that scale, it begins to take on a life of its own, reshaping reputations faster than any statement can correct. And across the city, Daniel felt that shift more directly. His office now filled with early morning calls that did not wait for courtesy, voices on the other end measured but firm, asking for clarity, for reassurance, for distance, each conversation tightening the space around him, because confidence in a man like him was not just about results. It was about image, and once that image fractured, the structure supporting it began to Adjust, and he responded with precision, offering controlled statements, promising explanations, trying to anchor something that was already drifting, but the responses he received were no longer automatic, no longer aligned. And that was when he realized the difference between influence and control. One can be maintained, the other can disappear without warning. And Vanessa sat across from him now, no longer at the window, her posture composed, but her presence altered, her questions more direct, less supportive, as if she too was recalibrating her position in a situation that no longer guaranteed advantage. And Daniel noticed it, the shift in tone, the absence of reassurance he had assumed would remain. And for a brief moment, he considered calling Emily, not out of concern but out of strategy, a calculation forming around what could still be managed. But he did not make the call, not yet, because even he understood that some moments cannot be undone through words. And back in the apartment, Emily stood slowly, moving with intention as she prepared for the day, not as a continuation of what had been, but as the start of something entirely different. And Jacob was already there, seated at the table with a laptop open, reviewing documents that had been organized overnight, communications sent, responses received, a network already forming around a process that was now in motion. And when Emily joined him, he turned the screen slightly, showing her the first official steps being taken, filings prepared, protections established, actions designed not to react to the past, but to secure the future. And she studied it carefully, absorbing each detail with the same calm she had found the night before, because once a decision is made, the work that follows becomes clear. And she nodded once, not as approval but as confirmation, and Jacob closed the laptop gently, understanding that the foundation had been set. And for a moment they both stood in the quiet of the room, the city beginning to wake around them, unaware that within this space something irreversible had already begun. And Emily moved toward the window, looking out at the skyline now fully lit, not with the same perspective she had held the night before, but with something steadier, something grounded in truth rather than appearance. And she realized that what had once felt like a loss of control had become something else entirely, an opportunity to rebuild without illusion. And far across the city, Daniel remained inside a structure that was beginning to shift beneath him, still trying to hold what he could, still believing in systems that no longer responded the way they once had. And between those two spaces, one defined by clarity, the other by resistance, the outcome was already beginning to take shape, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of certainty that does not need to announce itself to be real. By midday, the city had fully absorbed the story, not as a moment anymore, but as a narrative that people repeated with certainty, whether they had been there or not. And in rooms filled with glass walls and quiet deals, the name Daniel Whitmore was no longer spoken with the same ease. There was a pause now, a calculation, the kind that happens when reputation shifts faster than loyalty can adjust. And Daniel felt it in ways that no report could fully explain. Calls postponed, meetings shortened, language softened where it had once been confident. And even the silence carried meaning, because absence in business is rarely neutral. It signals movement, distance, reconsideration. And he sat at the head of a table that suddenly felt larger than before, his reflection faint against the polished surface as he listened to advisors speak in careful terms about optics, exposure, risk, words that circled around the truth without naming it directly. And for the first time, he did not interrupt. He did not redirect. He simply listened, because control had shifted in a way that could not be forced back into place. And across from him, Vanessa remained composed but distant, her attention no longer anchored to him, but to her own position within a changing environment. Her responses measured, her alignment no longer automatic. And that subtle change confirmed what Daniel was beginning to understand, that what had been built on perception could be undone by it just as quickly and miles away. Emily stepped into a different kind of room, one without cameras, without expectations, where decisions were recorded not for appearance but for consequence. And the atmosphere there was steady, professional, focused, the kind that does not react to headlines but to facts. And she moved through it with a calm that surprised even her. Not because the situation was simple, but because her role within it had become clear. And Jacob remained close but not leading, allowing her to speak, to decide, to define what came next in her own terms. And when documents were placed before her, she reviewed them carefully, not rushing, not hesitating, understanding that each page represented more than a process. It represented a boundary being drawn. And when she signed her name, it was not an act of anger. It was an act of alignment, a confirmation of something she had already chosen internally. And the weight of that moment did not come from the ink or the paper. It came from the quiet certainty behind it. And as the process moved forward around her, she felt something unexpected settle into place. Not victory, not relief, but stability, the kind that does not depend on another person's actions or decisions. And outside the building, the city continued its rhythm, unaware of the specific choices being made within its walls, but shaped by them all the same. And back across town, Daniel stood alone in his office as evening approached again, the skyline shifting from light to shadow, his reflection clearer now against the glass. And for a long moment he said nothing, did nothing, simply stood there as the reality of the day settled around him, not as a sudden collapse, but as a series of changes that could not be reversed. And somewhere within that stillness, he understood something that had never required his attention before. That control is not something you own. It is something others allow. And once that allowance changes, everything built on it must adjust. And in a quiet apartment across the city, Emily stood by her window once more, the lights returning to the skyline as they had the night before. But this time she was not looking for answers. She was simply observing, her hand resting gently where new life continued to grow, steady, unaffected by the noise of the world outside. And in that stillness there was a truth that did not need to be spoken. Because some endings do not arrive with final words. They arrive with a shift in direction, and some men lose everything they own just to learn what a woman's dignity is worth.